on page 33. And we have the Good Management Plans and Places again, and welcome Rebecca Sanders and Phil back again. And again, this is a bundle of plan changes, and we have made signal at the outset when we commenced the meeting that we are making a change and that we're not dealing with the regional view shafts and the height sensitive areas. John, would you like to introduce this bundle?
Look, I think it's best I just hand over to Phil and Rebecca to run you through the presentation, then we'll answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. They're pointing at you, Rebecca.
Oh, sorry, Rebecca. I knew it was Rebecca. So, Rebecca.
So through the chair, good afternoon. Today I have a short presentation to accompany my report, which is seeking endorsement to notify 4 plan changes to improve consistency in the Auckland Unitary Plan. We also have with us each of the reporting planners for each plan change, Marilyn Ford for Auckland-wide and overlays, Kath Coombs and Todd Alder for the coastal plan change, Juliana Cox for the plan change on zone chapters, and Cosette Saville for the plan change on the AUP viewer. So they are here to answer any questions on any of the plan changes which you might have.
Thank you.
So, as I'm sure all of you are aware, the Unitary Plan is a very complex document with multiple layers. It separates controls amongst overlays, zones, precincts and Auckland-wide provisions. Since the Unitary Plan was made operative in part in November 2016, plan users have been identifying issues and potential errors with the Unitary Plan. Plan change 4, which was the administration plan change, which has just been made operative in part, sought to address minor errors and minor anomalies within the Unitary Plan. However, at the conclusion of Plan Change 4, we still had a number of errors which needed to be addressed through a plan change which had slightly broader scope than Plan Change 4. This series of proposed plan changes has a slightly broader scope than Plan Change 4, but it still seeks to address issues which are technical in nature and not change any of the policy direction in the plan. In November 2017, we presented to this committee on the range of issues which we intended to address within these plan changes. So the 4 proposed plan changes generally align with topics within the Unitary Plan, but they all have the same purpose. The purpose of each plan change is to address technical issues or gaps in the provisions which are leading to outcomes which don't deliver on the policy direction of the plan. A technical issue is where a change is required to the Unitary Plan to ensure that the plan is essentially functioning how it was intended or functioning to deliver the objectives and policies. An example might be where the provisions are unclear and there's ambiguity in the plan, which is leading to differences in interpretations of certain kinds of provisions. Other examples might be where there is sort of an integration issue or a misalignment of provisions within the Unitary Plan between the different layers or different provisions within a chapter. The final plan change deals with mapping anomalies. This is basically where there's an issue with the spatial application of a zone, a precinct, a mapped control, or an overlay. An example might be where we have a split zone, which has arisen from a zone or precinct boundary not aligning with a property boundary. So essentially, this range of issues which have been identified are creating significant issues with the interpretation and the implementation of the Auckland Unitary Plan. So these plan changes seek to address these issues to make the plan more workable, but retain the policy direction which was decided on through the Auckland Unitary Plan hearings process. So in developing the 4 proposed plan changes, we've undertaken consultation both internally within Council and also with some external stakeholders. So firstly, extensive consultation has been undertaken with internal council departments and council-controlled organisations. So just to name a few, Resource Consents, the Auckland Design Office, Healthy Waters, Park Services, Auckland Transport and Watercare have played a role both in helping us identify issues within the plan and also reviewing how we propose to address those issues. Additionally, we've also consulted with local boards. Local boards were given the opportunity late last year to identify issues that they might have found within the plan. And then we also provided local boards with copies of the draft plan changes in Section 32 evaluation reports earlier this year. And we extended the invitation to sit down with local boards to go through any things that they might want to discuss in terms of the proposed content. We had 2 local boards who reached out to us with just wanting to clarify 2 matters which related to their local board areas, and that was largely to do with the final plan change, which is the plan change on the ARP viewer. Additionally, letters were sent to all owners and occupiers of properties which are affected by the proposed spatial changes. So we sent letters to the property owners earlier this year, and we outlined the change that related to their property and gave them the opportunity to discuss that with us further. So I think we had about 15 responses. 12 people just wanted to clarify what that meant for them. 2 provided further information which did actually lead us to amend our proposal as it related to their property. Draft copies of the coastal plan changes and sections of the copies of the coastal plan change and sections of the Auckland-wide and overlays plan change were also made available to a targeted group of stakeholders. These were stakeholders who have had a lot of input into these provisions through the hearings process and might be quite affected by some of the proposed amendments. They include the New Zealand Defence Force, the Ports of Auckland, marina operators, the Auckland Utility Operators Group and the Tupuna Maunga Authority. So due to the large scale of the proposed plan changes, we have undertaken consultation with 19 iwi authorities, which are listed in the agenda report. Iwi authorities were firstly engaged in October 2017 last year, where we went out to the iwi authorities to ask them to identify whether they had come across any issues in the unitary plan that they might want to have addressed. In July 2018, we also sent a letter updating the iwi authorities on our progress to date and the timeframes going forward. We advised when they would expect to receive a copy of the draft plan change in Section 32 reports, and we also asked them if they thought it was appropriate for whether the Hearings Commissioner should have tikanga experience. So in mid-August, we provided the iwi authorities with the first 3 plan changes and Section 32 reports. and the fourth plan change and Section 32 report was made available in September. With the letter that accompanied the plan changes in the Section 32 evaluation reports, we extended the invitation to iwi authorities if they would like to sit down and meet with us to go through any aspects of the plan change. So Ngāti Whātua o Ōrākei took us up on that offer, and they were generally supportive. We've also had some targeted consultation with Te Ākitai o Waha on one proposed change to the spatial extent of the sites of significance to mana whenua overlay in respect of one property, and they are, I understand, generally supportive of that. So the first of the four plan changes is the referred to in the agenda report as PCA, Auckland-wide and overlays. This plan change primarily seeks to address issues within the Auckland-wide and overlay chapters of the Unitary Plan. It also has some subsequent amendments to Chapter J, definitions, the AUP viewer, and also Appendix 2 and Appendix 17. There's a total of 81 themes of issues in this plan change, and you can see a breakdown in the pie chart on screen of what those themes of issues are. Just to note that that's the theme of issue. In terms of the text amendments, there's a great number more because there's often several amendments that relate to one theme. Also, just to note that not all of the Auckland-wide provisions or overlays are being addressed through this plan change because we haven't had issues that we've been notified about to address. As you can see from the pie chart, the biggest areas that this plan change is addressing is infrastructure and transport. Given the scale of this plan change, we are seeking from this committee to publicly notify this plan change. The second of the four plan changes is PCB Coastal. This issue seeks to primarily address technical issues within Chapter F Coastal. It's also seeking some subsequent amendments to Chapter J definitions in Appendix 7. There are 17 themes of issues which we are seeking to address through this plan change, and given the scale of this plan change, we're seeking that the Planning Committee endorse public notification of this plan change. Our third plan change is on the zone chapters. So this seeks to primarily make changes to the zone chapters. There's also a number of changes proposed to Chapter J, definitions. There is a total of 37 themes of issues which we're seeking to address through this plan change. These themes of issues primarily relate to the residential and business zones. I note that not all of the zones have amendments proposed to them. Obviously, given the scale of this plan change, we're seeking that this committee publicly endorse public notification of this plan change. So the final plan change, PCD, is to the Unitary Plan viewer. There are also subsequent amendments arising in this plan change to 11 precinct diagrams. This plan change seeks to address mapping anomalies on 189 properties. The types of anomalies being addressed include spot and split zones, misalignment of zones, controls, or precincts with property boundaries, and just general inconsistencies with the mapping of controls and overlays. As I've previously outlined in my presentation, we've gone out to all of the property owners who are affected by these amendments. And so, as a result, under Clause 5A of the first schedule of the Resource Management Act, we are actually now able to proceed with limited service notification of a plan change. So we've undertaken an assessment in terms of the requirements of the Act in relation to this plan change, and that's, I think, attachment B to the agenda report, and we're recommending that this committee approve the limited service notification of this plan change. So that's all from me, but I'm happy to answer any questions, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentations, we've got the wider team here if there are any questions specific to one of the plan changes.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. Very, very solid work. John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Possibly just one thing to add, just to give a bit of context. You've heard about a whole lot of amendments, anomalies, errors that we're correcting, but we do have to remember that this is the only fully combined plan under the RMA in the country, and it is the largest region by population and complexity in the country as well. So it's inevitable that as the plan starts to go into the implementation phase, that we do identify some areas for improvement. So many other councils go through a similar exercise 2 or 3 years into doing their district plan or their regional plan or their regional coastal plan, but this is a district plan, a regional coastal plan, and a regional policy statement. So hopefully you're not getting a sense that there are some major flaws with the plan. It really is just fine-tuning and refinements rather than anything radical here that we're recommending.
Okay. Any questions at this time, members? This is quite technical. This report is supported by an addendum, a very dense addendum, and there you will see, if you really are short on reading, there's about a week's worth there of all the various examples that the staff have looked at. Councillor Casey?
Yeah, just some comfort, John, about the 189 private properties contacted by letter. Did you say that you got 15 replies, or was that was 15 replies to that in particular?
Yes, that's correct.
How can you be sure that the other 174 have actually noted the letter and are aware of the controversy?
So obviously we can only send the letter and we get returned mail if they haven't received the letter, but we are proposing to notify those property owners and the neighbouring properties through this plan change. So there will be an opportunity for the property owners and the neighbouring properties to make a submission on the plan change. So if you like, the initial consultation that we did was just to make people aware really early in the process and seek their views before having to go through the formal plan change process, but that there's still the opportunity for them to make a submission.
And I suppose this, just an additional question is, what would be the biggest anomaly that you come across in reference to mapping? Like, what does it mean if you've got a boundary that's not quite right? What's the worst thing that we can has happened?
I might have to refer that to my colleague Cosette Saville.
Hi. In terms of scale, the main issue where there's a lot of properties affected is where a precinct boundary or a zoning boundary does not align with the property boundaries. So there's been a recent subdivision, and so that's where a lot of properties are affected, and it's just slightly moving the precinct boundary to align, so there's not a split zone and a precinct boundary running through the middle of properties, and that's where the consequential amendments to the precinct plans comes in. The most kind of controversial that
we've really worked to ensure that there aren't any controversial
that's the right
changes.
answer, John. That's the right
it's
answer.
correcting
That's been our
errors.
guiding principle. I mean, that shifting of the precinct boundary, what that means is that, there may be some slightly more permissive or more restrictive provisions in the precinct that will now apply by making this change that always should have applied. It's just through subdivision, property boundaries change, and we get these anomalies where the unitary plan stays static. It doesn't automatically shift to accommodate boundaries that shift through subdivisions. So it really is just fairly sensible, logical amendments that we don't believe will be controversial to any extent. I'm aware of one, just by way of another example, a site of significance to Mana Whenua, which, as we all know, are very, there's a lot of interest, particularly from Mana Whenua and others in those sites. A slight mapping boundary that we're proposing to align the boundary of that site with the actual physical remnant of a volcanic feature that's no longer there and we're in, but there is a part of the feature still remaining, and the mapping is just not lining up with what's physically there on the ground. Now, we did engage with iwi on that, and we had an initial response that raised some concerns. We've followed that up with the iwi representative, and they now appear comfortable with that boundary alignment. So it's just correcting mapping, those sorts of things.
Thank you.
The controversial one is probably where you do have a split zone, and you're trying to figure out whether it goes to the zoning on one side of the property or goes to the zoning on the other side of the property. And so you do need to look at the historical zoning patterns, look at the development that's on the property, look at any consents that have been approved, and then actually work out what is the right zone to apply.
But there will still be a chance for the property owner to contest that.
We'll write to those owners. They'll have the opportunity to submit over probably a 2-month period, at least a 2-month period, I think we're aiming for. So.
And one of the people who responded was where there was a split zone of light industry and fab. I was recommending it go to light industry based on the surrounding environment. They then provided additional information on the site and what it was being used for, and that actually influenced council's position. So through that communication and engagement, we were able to change our position.
And are these right across the region, or are they kind of right? Thank you.
Councillor Wayne Walker?
Yeah, I'm having difficulty locating the part that I was after in the density, but maybe you can assist me. So I know, because people have brought it to my attention, that there is an issue with some of the marinas, particularly Hobsonville Marina, and myself and some councillors have had the opportunity to read the advice of Robert Scott, I think it was, that was arguably at odds with decisions that the council made and the independent commissioners made, because they didn't have his advice. So my understanding is there's an anomaly there around the zoning, and in particular I'm referring to residential zoning in a marina area that's subject to inundation, that it apparently is at odds with the Empowering Act and the coastal policy provisions. So is there anything in here dealing with that anomaly, or is that going to be subject to something later?
Well, through the chair, as you've described it, that would go well beyond the scope of what we would say is an anomaly. So, I mean, that's an issue that we are looking into, and we can keep you updated, and potentially it will be the subject of a report back to the committee in the new year on. We might address the issues that you're raising, but it's well beyond the scope of anything that you'd find in this plan change to address the sorts of issues that you're indicating are of concern with Hobsonville Marina.
Councillor Cooper?
And I had one other question, Mr. Chair. I'm assuming that there are other issues over and above what we're dealing with here. Is it possible for councillors to have a list of those issues so that we have an idea of what's coming up?
Well, if I could just say, a number of you have asked me to look at various issues in the unitary plan, and I put that question to Manager of Plans and Places, John Dogood, and John's team is having an initial scan of the unitary plan as to what we might address or readdress, things that we've possibly lost. Councillor Bartley's raised the question, and others actually, the question of the universal access provisions. Separately, we're looking at the tree provisions. That's a body of work that Councillor Holsall is leading, that crosses over into
boarding houses,
the work of John Dogood. So there is a sort of, I wouldn't say it's a body of work, but there's an informal body of work, I guess, that's being undertaken. So if members have any concerns about the unitary plan, maybe email myself or directly to John and say, look, is this worthy of picking up in your scan of what we might take another look at?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it would be useful to perhaps have a workshop or at least some information on what is being looked at. Certainly, I've got an ongoing issue with the tree provisions, as have many people within the community. I'd suggest there are issues around boarding houses in some residential zones. There are probably a variety of issues that councillors have concerns about, and it would be useful to know just where they're at.
Well, look, let me pick that up with John, and I'll discuss that with Councillor Hills as Deputy Chair and others. I also am aware that we've got to get our priorities right. So there's a large body of work that Plans and Places is undertaking to deliver housing for Aucklanders. It's, base one. So we just got to make sure that whatever we embark on is going to add value. So let's, can we take that up? And if you've got some concerns, please email me or John Dogood, Councillor. Councillor Cooper?
Well,
Sorry, John.
Just the other thing to add, as you're aware, I think we had a report to Planning Committee last month or the month before about the Section 35 monitoring requirements under the RMA. So we have to monitor how well the unitary plan is achieving its objectives, and so that is a body of work that's underway. But that's a very comprehensive exercise. So some things that we're aware of that may warrant further investigation, we really need to wait until we've monitored the impacts on the ground for another 6 months or a year or perhaps even 2 years before we launch into making policy changes. But no, I take the point, and as Councillor Darby's mentioned, we've shared some initial ideas. It's a pretty short list at this point in time. We are focused on things like this anomalies plan change, the special character plan change, current plan changes that are working their way through submissions and hearings processes, the greenfield rezoning at Whanuapai and places like that. So there's a pretty busy pipeline of amendments over the next year or so, but as I say, a short list of potential ideas that we can potentially bring back to the committee if Chair and Deputy Chair support that.
Thank you.
I might just add to that at the detail level as well, because these sort of technical errors and anomalies continue to come up all the time from people who are using the plan. So we do have an email, the unitary plan at Auckland Council, where we build up a parking lot of these issues so that we can actually go through the future ones as well to actually look at the next opportunity to be able to make a similar type of plan change. So like plan change 4 and these plan changes, I'm sure before we get to the end of the 10-year life of the plan, we will also have identified other examples of where there are misalignments within the plan that are at the technical level that need fixing.
Councillor Cooper.
I didn't have my hand up, I didn't think.
Okay. Any other queries, inquiry on this one? It's quite complex, members, but a lot of it is obvious tidy-ups that we need to do here. John, at the outset of the meeting, I just did explain that we weren't going to be considering the regional view shafts and the height-sensitive areas. You're having continuing discussions with the Tupuna Maunga Authority to have raised some matters with you. So we're reflecting that in the A and the B in a modification there. Do you want to just briefly go over that?
Certainly. We presented to the Maunga Authority, I think it was last Monday, and it became quite clear that the 5 amendments that we were proposing really warranted a further discussion, further engagement for the Maunga Authority to really get a good understanding of what we're trying to achieve, and then I guess have a position that they're quite comfortable with. So we really feel that we do need more time to work with the Maunga Authority over the next few weeks. I think you all received some correspondence from the Chair of the Maunga Authority raising some concerns about the just the need for more time for engagement. So really that's the reason why we're seeking another 2 or 3 weeks to work things through and see if we can reach an agreed position by the 27th of November.
Great, thank you. Councillor Simpson?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Do we have any communication with people who have inputted into this as part of the unitary plan process in the first place?
we're not specifically going back to all submitters on the unitary plan, if that's what you're asking. But
I'm not
if
asking
they
that,
made a
you know.
submission on this topic, we may have.
So through the chair, for people who raised issues to the unitary plan inbox, we went back to them earlier this year and advised them of the outcome of whether their issue would be addressed in the plan change or not.
That's what I was asking. Thank you very much.
Covered that base. Member Namani.
Oh, kia ora. I'm pleased that it's been withdrawn for further engagement with the Maunga Authority. One thing part of that, I guess, on reflection and going forward, it did appear that the Maunga Authority weren't part of the earlier communications when the stakeholder review. It was an internal, and it was inward facing,
Yeah.
and perhaps there's a lesson perhaps in that.
Mr. Chair, yeah, I'd just like to acknowledge we have learned a lesson there that really any changes that we're making to provisions that affect the Maunga, we really need to engage with the Maunga Authority early on. On one of the 5 amendments that were proposed, we have had dialogue over a couple of months, and it's a tricky one. But even on the other 4, we really should have engaged a bit earlier on. So we'll certainly do that in the future.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you, Member Namani. So there's one other change, members, at F. I don't think anything should be ever solely delegated to the chair of a committee, so added the deputy chair's name there just as an extra check. And somebody like to move?
Just have one further question, Mr.
Councillor
Chair.
Filipina move, and one further question over second. Councillor Hills, and another question, Councillor Wainwell.
And that's just a question on people able to submit on this. So I'm making the assumption that anyone can submit irrespective of whether they've been a submitter to the unitary plan or not.
Yes, that's correct.
Thanks.
All good. Okay, it's moved and seconded. Oh, sorry, Councillor Filipina, I've got you down here. Did you want to speak to it, or?
Just very briefly, through you, Chair, and again, as you mentioned at the beginning of the committee meeting, around the changes to the recommendation, I wanted to acknowledge, obviously, John, you and yourself, Chair, because myself and Councillor Bartley and local board members attended the Tupuna Maunga Authority meeting that John and Phil and the team submitted. So I'm glad that this is in here because, John, you're right, around anything that relates to Tupuna Maunga Authority, it's important that consultation takes first. So just wanted to acknowledge that. And Chair, you know, when we talk about boarding homes, I mean, I need to acknowledge, obviously, the regulatory committee with Councillor Cooper, and that's with all the boarding homes that work and is being done there. I think, Councillor Cooper, there's going to be another update on the results of the visits to the boarding homes, so that needs to be taken into effect, as well as the meeting we had last month around the standards and the submissions. So, Chair, look, I just look forward to the consultation with the Tupuna Maunga, but also moving forward around the workshop that relates to everything, and we can encapsulate things. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Filipina. And Councillor Bartley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, I just wanted to say it's good to see that amendment in there about more engagement with the Maunga Authority, because volcanoes, Maunga Authority, common sense really, eh? So I wanted to ask, what goes on with monitoring? Because you talked about 6, maybe 12 months for monitoring the unitary plan. So what do you do for the monitoring, and what are you monitoring?
Okay. So under the Act, we have to produce, after 5 years, once the plan has been in place, a report on the effectiveness of the environmental controls that are in the plan. Now, you could have literally thousands of indicators from within the plan about how it's performing, because down at the detail level of all of the different rules and standards, we have literally thousands of them. So it's important to go through an exercise of identifying what are essentially the key performance indicators of the success of the plan. So the report that came to committee a few months ago identified those parts of the regional policy statement that we've started to actually work down through the plan on to identify what are the key performance indicators of the success or non-success of that part of the regional policy statement. So that program of work is on track for 2021 to be able to prepare an overall report about how the plan is performing. Now, many of the provisions that are in the plan take a while to actually determine if they're successful or not. There may not be very much development that relates to them, very many consents to see how they're progressing on the ground, and sometimes issues take a very long time to actually show whether they're improving or declining. Some of the natural environment indicators that we've got relate to things such as aquifers, can relate to decades, if not hundreds of years of recharge activity. So you need to be able to identify what are indicators that really do measure the success of the particular plan that we've got. And that's why the exercise is something which has been done as an overall effort by Plans and Places with other departments across council.
Okay, thank you. And I'm also interested in the work around the boarding houses, because I've got boarding houses going up in residential areas in my ward that didn't have them before. And so now residents are moving out of the street because they're worried about the boarding houses. So very interested to monitor that and to see what the work is happening around boarding houses.
Thanks, Councillor Bartley. I think we'll conclude it at that. It's moved by Councillor Philippina and seconded by Deputy Chair Councillor Hills. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Aye. To the contrary, no, and we will declare that carried. Item 11 is procedural, I think, and would somebody like to move?
Yep.
Thank you, Councillor Casey. Second, Councillor Simpson. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. Declare that carried. I'll just check with the staff. We will now close the meeting and take, I think, 5 minutes before.